So, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the Sacred Wisdom Podcast. I am joined with the amazing Stephen Denman today, and we will be discussing American Indian folklore. This is a chapter within the Mysterious Realities book. If you wish to go into more detail within this subject matter, you can actually see the links below. So for many years, the American Indian tribes have been talking and there's a lot of connections to these ultra-terrestrials and extraterrestrials. And something that's always fascinated me with these, how the American Indian culture was completely decimated. And I think they had a lot of secret knowledge that we could have obtained and was possibly destroyed for reasons that we are not told about. And here is the amazing Stephen to go into more detail on these subjects. And welcome, Stephen. Thank you for being here.
Hello, Zach, and it's wonderful to be here again.
And tell us more about the American Indian tribes. First of all, let's just start a little bit about American Indians in general, because there is an idea that there was civilizations before the American Indians, and the American Indians are kind of seen as this primitive culture of tribes that just sat around fires and wigwams and, you know, fired bows and arrows and stuff like this.
Yes.
And yes, they did, but there was a lot more to them than that. And let's go into that deal. So talk a little bit first about the culture of the American Indians, Steve.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I'll reiterate what you just touched on there, is that the majority of individuals on planet Earth have been given a cultural perception of the American Indian tribes as being those individuals that, you know, tamed the Appaloosa, the Nakota, and the Mustang horses, or they were just involved in smoke dances, earth lodges, spirit lodges, rain dances, and so forth. But they were a lot more than that. And you have to remember that pretty much all of the Native Americans were very focused and keyed into the astral plane. They were very much, shall we say, astral guardians, and very much aware of how important it was to prevent specific types of negative life forms or demons, whatever name you want to give them, from entering into the 3D holographic reality of planet Earth, especially into the sacred grounds, the hallowed grounds that were so precious to the Native Americans, you know, in different parts of the United States. So I would say, from my perspective, when it comes to looking at the different Native American tribes, I think they are so etheric. They were so focused on and so aware of the connections of the ultra-terrestrials and the extraterrestrials to planet Earth. They were very focused on places such as the M45 Pleiades Star Cluster, which is in the Taurus constellation. They're very focused on the idea of the Great White Brotherhood, who were going to return one day, the true white race, to become the new spiritual teachers or world teachers of humanity. They were very focused also on how the Hollow Earth interconnected with the landscapes of the United States of America and Canada. They were very focused also on what we've already touched on, which is supernatural life forms such as ghosts, and also things like fairies, the little folk, you know, and elves and gnomes and dwarves, and obviously that very well-known subject now, which is the white giants of North America, which so many of the American Indian tribes so fiercely warred against for many, many generations. So they're quite unique, the Native Americans, and so much of their spirituality was deliberately obliterated, suppressed, censored, and deleted by the settlers from mainland Europe, who were, shall we say, at the top in terms of the various blue bloods or aristocracies, specifically focused on quelling and suppressing American Indian folklore, because so many of the stories that they had gave great indication to the true history of the past of human beings on planet Earth.
So we've discussed this before, but when we talk about the east coast of America being possible remnants of Atlantis, and the structures that were used in the world fairs were actually, they were possibly from the landmass of Atlantis. Yeah. Now, America, while these cities existed, say 400, well, let's go back, well, it's way back before then, let's go back 500 years. So the American Indians were existing coinciding with these cities, or how were they interacting with that world that was existing on the East Coast? And there probably were parts of that Tartarian world dotted over mainland America as well, of course, but discuss a little bit about that.
Okay, so if you look at the American Indians, the various Native American tribes, whether they were living in, they were living in wigwams or wickiups. For example, with the American Plains Indians of places like, Utah and Arizona and other locations in the United States, they believe the closer you live to Mother Earth, the more naturally that you live, in the external ecosystems around you without the need for bricks and mortar dwellings, for example, was extremely important for their own spiritual development. So I would say that was a lifestyle choice which existed for many millions of American Indian tribes who lived simultaneously alongside the civilization of Great Tartaria that had many advanced and beautiful, very eloquent looking architectural designed buildings across the United States of America that were involved in drawing down telluric electrical energy from the atmosphere into electrical capacitors to create boundless free heating and lighting in those dwellings. But I also believe there were many American Indians that also were trading with the Tartarians in the United States. And these Tartarians, I just want to clarify that the Tartarians were both human, so these Aryan type, and then also the giants, these Tartarian giants that also existed. It was a coexistential civilization between both life forms here on planet Earth. And I think in the very ancient past, in prehistory, there was a number of disasters that led to the cataclysm and the eventual collapse of the civilization these Tartarian giants may have had. As I've mentioned previously, they were known, these white giants, to have these vast metallic shining cities up in the Appalachian Mountains, the Rocky Mountains, and the Cascade Mountain region in the United States. So we know that there's been a number of really massive geological and atmospheric upheavals on planet Earth over many generations. But at one point in ancient history, there was quite a harmonious social structure in the United States of America and Canada, where the American Indians lived alongside both in teepees or wigwams and wickiups with the Tartarian Aryans. So it was a lifestyle choice that a large number of them had. It wasn't that they were primitive in any way whatsoever.
Now, the old American photographs we see with these American Indians in, sometimes, this would be around mid 1800s, them kind of that type of photography, when photography was kind of released. I'm always very suspicious when I look at these photographs, almost like some of these American Indians are not even necessarily Indian. And it seems that these photographs would be that they're almost staging something to make this kind of image to us as people of what American Indians were.
Yeah, I totally agree. The photographs that were taken, you're mainly of a Native American chieftain and his wife and maybe a son and daughter, were completely synthetic photographs. They were done in studios by, funded by European aristocrats or by the local municipal authority that had established territories.
Documenting their version of his story. There we go.
We go forward to the time of Hollywood where they're producing all the cowboy and Indian movies. So you see actors like Charles Bronson and Lee Van Cleef playing the roles of Native Americans. Well, why were they using
yes,
European
it's very insulting, right?
Yeah. Instead of using Native Americans, okay, there has been many movies made where the actual actors involved are racially and ethnically Native American, but it's like they were trying to give us their version of what they wanted us to believe was the history of the United States of America. And actually, the true history of America when it comes to the Native Americans is radically different in many ways. One example of this that is never talked about by Western science, and certainly not talked about by the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., is the Montaukett Indians. Now, the Montaukett Indians were from the Long Island area, which is the New York State in the eastern United States. It is believed that when European settlers first arrived in the area of Long Island, they saw that the Montaukett had constructed a number of small pyramids. These pyramids also, like the pyramids next to the Hill of Tara in the Boyne Valley in County Meath in Eastern Ireland, had quartz capstones. These were then demolished, much like many of the serpent mounds were demolished. Many thousands of serpent mounds actually were demolished by European settlers in the Ohio River Valley area in the United States of America. So again, suppression, deletion, the rewriting of history, the same as all the staged photographs of these eloquent looking Native Americans made to look like European nobles with their, feathered headdresses. They're put in, in many of them actually dressed in European suits as well. So it's designed to create a visual imprint that is fusing, shall we, or merging European culture with Native American
This is
culture.
progression, showing us progression. This is, they're going from these wigwams to nice men in suits. It's sort of, we see the evolution. Of course, this is right. And, this is the best version that could have happened, of course. But one as well, the Native American Star People legend, Steve. Now, these are incredible stories again. And let's go into some of that and talk about the Pleiades Star System, because there is a huge connection there.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the Zuni Indians or the Hopi Pueblo Indians. You can also look at the Cherokee, the Algonquin. You can look at the Montaukett, as I've just mentioned. So what we have is so many of these Native American Indian tribes have some kind of spiritual, ethnic, and I believe racial connection to the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades star cluster. So one of the stars that they really resonate with is Taygeta in the actual M45 star cluster, the Pleiades star cluster.
Yeah.
You know that it's believed there is a number of planets and moons there that resonate beyond space-time, because the Nordic Pleiadians, or these Pleiadian Aryans, which really represent the Great White Brotherhood, in ancient history visited the North American continent on hundreds of occasions over literally thousands of years.
Their shining palaces, right? It was the talk of they leave their shining palaces and come down and visit the American Indians.
That's right, and they would descend in their silver plates or silver discs from the night skies, and would converse with these different American Indian tribes, and would share spiritual knowledge with them. And so we know there's this quite incredible interstellar spiritual perception that the American Indians had. They've always been connected to shall we say, the cosmic heavens. They're not way beyond just this solar system. So we know that they represented very important individual humans on planet Earth, not just because the American Indian tribes had a racial and ethnic and cultural memory, not just of the Atlantean continent and the islands of Atlantis, but also the Lemurian continent in the Pacific Ocean, and the Great White Brotherhood from the Pleiades star cluster in the Taurus constellation. I mean, when you take all this and bring it together, and all the vast amounts of American Indian folklore concerning the Hollow Earth,
it's huge.
You have to, they're just incredible. And one of the main issues is because so many of the American Indian languages are so complex, their lexicons are so complex, their vocabularies are so complex, it's been very difficult for many academics to really fully understand a lot of their folk tales and properly translate them into the English language. And of course, so many of the American Indian tribes were completely destroyed. Their original languages, they have literally been lost in the span of time.
Well, you have the Hopi Pueblo Indians who use the word Anu, which means ant or pincher. And then you have the word Naki, which means friends. So then we come on to what is called, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with who's watching this, who is the Anunnaki, meaning ant friends. So let's talk a little bit about that, Steve, and that connection to Reticular A and Zeta Reticular B. I'm just very interested in that whole kind of the connection to the stars and what maybe was going on there. So talk a little bit about that.
Another connection they had was to the reticulum constellation. And so you have a binary system there, which is, I think, Zeta Reticuli 1 and Zeta Reticuli 2. And there's a number of planets that orbit this binary system. And obviously, when it comes to the idea of alien abduction, we know about the Zeta Reticulan type A greys and the Zeta Reticulan type B greys, who genetically originated from the Reticulum constellation. But
so let's just say on that, they've been visiting that part of the world for thousands of years. So
yes,
where is there evidence of that? Is that from within the pictures and within the stories of the American Indians? Right. Okay.
A mixture of both the American Indian folklore in terms of their stories, their accounts, and so on, but also there's thousands and thousands of petroglyphs carved on hundreds of rocks all across the North American continent. You have the carvings of the Anasazi Indians, and they are ethnically related to the Hopi Pueblo Indians and the Zuni Indians in the United States of America. And that's just one example. It's so vast, the amount of evidence in terms of petroglyphic carvings that exist, especially amongst the American Plains Indians in places like Utah and Arizona, and obviously across parts of New Mexico and Texas. It's quite profound. I mean, you go into parts of the Mojave Desert in Southern California, some of the petroglyphic carvings there clearly show what appear to be Zeta Reticulan type A greys and Zeta Reticulan type B greys. So we know there's the Great White Brotherhood. We know there's the connection to the different greys. So in other words, what we're looking at is this interstellar connection between the American Indians, therefore the Native American folklore, beyond the solar system, beyond planet Earth, to do with various ultra-terrestrials and extraterrestrials in the Milky Way galaxy. So
the connection there, and people who are in the USA will know about this, but obviously Devil's Tower and the Meitei Tipler, the Bears Lodge by the Lakota Indians, which is again a fascinating area. Some people describe it being an actual tree trunk, which is very interesting. But the actual Devil's Tower would seem it was some sort of landing plate, would you say, Steve, or some sort of takeoff platform? It was obviously designed on some sort of ley line, but what do you see the Devil's Tower as?
Well, some people say it's the petrified remains of a tree trunk, an enormous tree, and apparently all trees on Earth grew to 2,000-3,000 feet in height in ancient history.
What's your view on that?
I don't believe that for a minute. I think that's a complete distortion, a bit like the flat earth theory. It's about creating diversion and confusion and wasting people's time going into more conspiracy woo-woo to actually just create more escapism and not actually using scientific analysis to look at what's really going on.
Would you want to just say, which we actually mention, if anybody wants to purchase in the book, you would talk a little bit about Devil's Tower and in the sense of the Seven Maidens and all this kind of connection to the Pleiades Star System. Let's just discuss a little bit about that. And what is the story of Devil's Tower?
Well, I mean, there's many accounts. The Lakota Sioux Indians have their account of what the Devil's Tower is, that from the Pleiades star cluster, these hairy humanoids, these bear-like giant humanoids or gigantic beings were basically deposited onto planet Earth from a silver disc from the Pleiades, from the Great White Brotherhood.
And you just say they're like a Sasquatch, right?
Sasquatch or Bigfoot and so forth. But it was their claws that carved into the rock what appeared to be these long furrows that make it look like, shall we say, a tree stump when it isn't really a tree. It's just the way the actual geological formation has developed over many millions of years. But what we have to remember is also that in the movie directed by Steven Spielberg called Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the Devil's Tower was used. And that's not something that should be ignored, because obviously there was a giant covert spaceport built on the other side of the Devil's Tower. The US Army was evacuating all the local residents and the farmers in that area, and they were giving very spurious reasons for doing so. So we know that there is obviously some connection. There's definitely a huge geomagnetic ley line that runs directly through and underneath the Devil's Tower. We know that there's probably geomagnetic ley line convergences in that area of the United States of America. So yeah, it's a very special place indeed. And obviously, we have to remember that when it comes to American Indian folklore, whether or Irish Celtic folklore or European folklore in general, that the way that people in ancient history describe things was how they could associate visually what they were trying to process in their minds with things that were tangible to their own existences at those points in history. So, for example, an unidentified flying object or UFO was a silver plate or a flaming shield of the heavens.
Mm.
So when you take a look at the Devil's Tower, when they're describing it as a huge tree, is that somehow connected to the archetype of the world tree that's seen in Nordic and Scandinavian mythology? Because the world tree is also part of many parts, shall we say, of American Indian folklore. So that's in itself something that we need to consider, and maybe it represented something else. So, there's lots of unanswered questions there. And the more you think about American Indian folklore, the more you study these stories and try and decipher the symbolism in these stories, you get to some very interesting alternative views on ancient history, especially when it comes to the Atlantean continent and the islands of Atlantis, the Lemurian continent, and the Great White Brotherhood from the Pleiades Star Cluster and so forth.
So there's another interaction that happened between the Native Americans and the spacecraft, and that was in 1945. And this was before the Roswell incident. So we're always told that the Roswell incident happened in 1947. And, that was the big kind of first UFO crash. But there's been a lot of UFOs recorded in the past, especially with the Native Americans. Discuss a little bit about that, Steve, and how were these beings interacting with the Native Americans? Were they taking the Native Americans' knowledge, or were they just giving the knowledge to the American Indians? What was going on there?
I think the relationship the American Indian tribes had with the Pleiadian Aryans and these Zeta Reticulan type A grays and Zeta Reticulan type B grays was radically different than the relationship that unfortunately developed after the signing of the Greada Treaty on the 20th of February 1954 at Murakami Airfield, which became Edwards Air Force Base in Kern County, Southern California. It's almost as if there was a complete change in the relationship. We know from many individuals who've done research that the various galactic federations or galactic councils actually have a very beneficial relationship with the Greys, for example. They're not actually beings that should be classed as malevolent. There's been a huge amount of misunderstanding and shall we say paranoia concerning alien abduction phenomena when it comes to the Greys. In fact, the Greys should be viewed as part of the spiritual development for many human beings on planet Earth. But what they do seems very sinister and very frightening because of the way it's done.
Yeah.
But we have to also remember that, as I've said many times before, up until around, I think, the 30th of April 2000, there was huge amounts of ongoing alien abduction by the Rigelian Greys, also known as the Orion Greys or tall Greys, and the short Greys or Zeta Reticulan type A Greys and Zeta Reticulan type B Greys, which have really rapidly diminished since then to almost being non-existent. So we know there's been a huge spiritual change on this planet, and that's obviously very positive. And so I think things are going back to the way they were when the American Indians had, shall we say, an interstellar relationship with these various ultra-terrestrials and extraterrestrials from beyond space-time and beyond our solar system.
Another story which is fascinating as well is the 12-year-old Dakota Indian, Mayapia Wambley, and his grandfather, where they actually encountered, and that was in 1945 as well, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So that was a crashed UFO, and then they actually, or was it crashed, or was it actually landed, and they actually started interacting with these beings over a period of time. So they said that these beings have been visiting this planet for over 15,000 years. So, I mean, tell me more about that story, because apparently, after they reported this, they filled the whole area, didn't they, with a lake. So actually, where this UFO was supposedly landed, or Mayapia Wambley found this UFO, they actually filled it in with water. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that's basically, it was a form of concealment of what went on. So we know that
This is like another X-Files story. So these little stories, guys, that we see on X-Files, understand that these do happen. There is UFO incidences that happen around the world that need to be disclosed and covered up. And this happens. Right. I don't know. Just do you think it happens regularly, Steve?
Yes, more regularly than people realize. And you got to remember that when World War II ended on the 8th of May, 1945, this event with Mapia Wambley and his grandfather on the Yankton Indian Reservation in the United States. I think.
So yeah, so let's go with that story. Just explain a little bit about that story, because I keep interrupting you. Sorry.
Okay, so we got to remember that when World War II ended on the 8th of May 1945, it was only a few months later, on the evening of the 13th of October 1945, that Mapia Wambley and his grandfather, who were resting at the Yankton Indian Reservation in South Dakota in the United States, suddenly heard these rather loud noises outside. So it appears as though the UFO, from remember the exact details, had a malfunction. It didn't actually crash in the sense of, say, the Roswell incident, which occurred on the 4th of July, 1947 in southern New Mexico. Right. We know that these extraterrestrials had to carry out maintenance of some nature. So, yes, the actual area where the actual UFO landed was then infilled with what appears to be an artificial lake on the Yankton Indian Reservation by security police from the US Air Force. It is believed they were stationed at Ellsworth Air Force Base at the time. So, there was obviously a cover-up of what went on. Now, those extraterrestrials on board that spacecraft, they weren't, from what the description that was given, they certainly weren't the Great White Brotherhood or these Pleiadian Aryans, and they certainly weren't Greys who were visiting planet Earth. So they seemed very benevolent, and they had a conversation with these extraterrestrials. And there are huge numbers of extraterrestrials, believe it or not, that are benevolent, but the vast majority don't particularly want to get involved with communicating with human beings. But we have to remember Mapia Wambley and his grandfather both actually went inside the crashed UFO where it had landed, where it had malfunctioned and partially crashed. So it was almost on a soul personality level. It was part of their experiential understanding to establish a relationship and communicate with those extraterrestrials. A quite fascinating case, really.
It is. It amazed me, and I love the idea that there's these beings visiting this planet on a constant basis. We kind of sometimes feel very alone on this planet, and we feel like we look up to the stars in this kind of hope, and that there is going to be other beings or other intelligence that will actually interact with those of us that want to be aware on this planet and conscious, because that's where we're heading. We need to all be conscious, guys. So everybody watching this is to help expand you and to open your consciousness up. Thank you, Steve. The subject we've covered today, this is only very brief. We go into more detail in it in the book Mysterious Realities, which is a whole chapter. Of course, we'll be talking more about Native American culture because it's a fascinating subject. And Stephen's knowledge, this is just skimming the surface, and what Stephen talks about with these subjects, it is very deep and profound how amazing the Native Americans were. And we really need to understand how incredible this knowledge is. And where we are today is we have de-evolved from this knowledge, all right? We have not integrated the knowledge we have learned from the past. So please check out the link below if you'd like to buy our book. And thank you so much, Steve. As always, it is always a pleasure talking to you. And we have lots of discussions like this, and I'm excited as always to talk more about them. So it's bye from me. Thank you, Steve.
And it's bye from me.